Justice of the soul, the highest state of human existence, the whole. This is why punishment, no escape is the goal. Consider the truth every day, every stroll. Consider truth when reflecting on all philosophy, righteous existence, and all of human interest. Consider truth when relating what's right and wrong, temperance, what to do and how to stay strong. Consider truth when thinking about inquiry, while studying justice, authority, superiority.
Hey everyone, Dr. Silvermintz back with another spotlight lecture on the trial and death of Socrates. Socrates is without question the most important thinker in the entire intellectual tradition, and especially in the history of philosophy. He's so significant in the history of philosophy that we categorize philosophers that predate Socrates as pre-Socratic. That is because Socrates starts an absolute revolution in the history of ideas, where he, for the first time, applies the objectivity of philosophy to the study of ethics and psychology and politics. Now, given Socrates' prominence in the history of ideas, it is absolutely shocking to ponder that the ancient Athenians in 399 brought him up on legal charges for specifically targeting his intellectual inquiries and investigations, and end up condemning him and sentencing him to a death sentence. This is absolutely shocking in our contemporary world, where we celebrate great minds, minds like an Einstein, a Shakespeare, a Mozart. To think that we would put such great minds to death, that we would sacrifice one more concerto, one more development by a great physicist like Einstein, it seems utterly perplexing to us. So how did the ancient Athenians come to be so disturbed by Socrates that they would result in giving him the death sentence? Socrates comes at the end of what was a whole intellectual enlightenment that begins in the 6th century BC, where thinkers for the first time were challenging the mythological understanding of nature, and for the first time attempting to explain the natural world by appealing to a rational account. They were giving scientific explanations to explain the workings of the universe, rather than appealing to a supernatural world of deities. This intellectual movement, today we term these thinkers pre-Socratic, but in their own day, they didn't realize they were coming before this guy Socrates, but in their own day we refer to them as natural physicists or scientists. And this movement gave birth to a second movement of thinkers who were looking and applying this same objective approach to social and political norms. But whereas the natural scientists found universality, the sophists found that each culture devised its own system of ethics, its own system of politics, its own system of laws. And thus the sophists declare that all laws are merely conventional, they're made up. And if they're made up, then somebody should do what's in their own interest, rather than merely blindly following the laws of the city.
You might recall that Protagoras was a sophist, one of that accursed crew of so-called philosophers, usually foreigners, who could speak learnedly on a subject whether they knew anything about it or not, who for money could teach you to make the worst side of an argument appear the better, so you could get ahead. Always arguing and questioning, these sophists destroyed men's faith in the old truths. They made our young people clever, but not wise.
This new movement had been overturning all of the social mores and had been instructing young men, ambitious young Athenians, to use the tricks of rhetoric to manipulate others in the law courts, in the political arena, to climb up the social and political hierarchy, not by dint of their intelligence, not by caring for the good of the people, but by pursuing their own self-interest and using rhetoric to manipulate others. And Socrates gets lumped in with all of these intellectuals, with both the natural scientists that had preceded him, as well as the sophists. It turns out he was neither of the two. But the Athenians were at a particularly low point in the 399 BC, at the point that they bring him up on legal charges. They had just endured a long and tumultuous 30-year war with the Spartans. The Peloponnesian War lasted from 431 to 404 BC. And the Athenians, who were at the middle of the 5th century BC under Pericles' statesmanship, rose to give us the legacy of one of the greatest civilizations that had ever lived, that gave us the great artistic achievements of the Parthenon and the various art forms of Greek comedy and tragedy, had fallen to the Spartans and were in a state of utter disarray. And they needed a scapegoat to blame. And this gets hurled on to Socrates. The woes of Athens gets hurled onto Socrates as the scapegoat. And Miletus, along with Anytus and Lycon, bring the charges against him, primarily that he was an atheist, and that not only that he had lost belief in the gods of the city, but was introducing new deities and corrupting the young with these beliefs.
He does nothing but confuse and disrupt. No Spartan spy has been as dangerous as Socrates. He's destroyed the morality of our forefathers. Athens has been torn by war and tyranny. Our democracy has just been restored. Our city has the right, it has the duty to destroy such as he. Don't be misled by his glib words, his philosopher's eloquence.
Time.
He will try to make... Just one more word. You frustrate the state in the vengeance it is due it for the transgressions of this evil old man. The crime will fall on your own heads. Vengeance of the gods will be on you.
So the question arises, is a real historical question. How could the Athenians have been so confused to have mistaken Socrates, who we know spent and devoted his life to helping better the young and to help educate his fellow Athenians to lead an examined life, to examine their souls, and to lead a more virtuous life? How could they have mistaken him for the corruption promulgated by the sophists? And as states, his first condemnation of him occurred within the playwright Aristophanes' satirical comedy, The Clouds, where Aristophanes lampoons the entire intellectual enlightenment of the natural scientists, of the sophists, and uses Socrates as a figurehead of this entire movement. Even though Socrates may not have practiced science in the manner of the natural sciences, even though he opposed the sophists and devoted his whole life to arguing for the objectivity of ethics, Socrates was such a recognizable figure that most scholars believe Aristophanes used him to lampoon the entire movement.
Do you remember Aristophanes' play, The Clouds?
Oh, Socrates!
What do you want, mortal?
What are you doing up there?
I walk upon the air and elevate my mind. Only up here, dangling my vast intellect in the heavens, can I scientifically perceive the secrets of the universe.
By Zeus, what marvelous words!
Zeus? Did I hear you say Zeus? Are you mad, sir? There is no Zeus.
Oh, Zeus? Then who makes it rain?
Have you ever seen it rain out of an empty sky?
No.
But when there are clouds, it rains?
Yes.
Therefore, sir, it is the clouds that cause rain, not Zeus.
Powerfully argued. But what about thunder? Surely the gods cause thunder.
Reflect, sir. When you gorge yourself on your wife's stew, does not your belly rumble? Think of the rumble your tiny stomach makes. Then think of the sound the boundless clouds can produce when they have indigestion.
Oh, sacred and wondrous thoughts. Teach me to reason like you, O Socrates, and success will be mine.
So Aristophanes makes a very poignant point there in critiquing the scientific revolution. He's using Socrates there as if he's one of the natural scientists that is reinterpreting the explanation from mythology that had used the gods as a way of explaining the natural world and reinterpreting them rationalistically. And that makes the old ways of the gods into a comedy, of course. The greatest sign of ancient mythology, the greatest symbol of the gods' wrath and their supervening over the world of mortals was, of course, Zeus's lightning bolt, the thunder and lightning that would come from the upper realm down to the lower realm. Zeus, the god over justice, not only was the lightning bolt of Zeus a way of understanding such a traumatic thing of being in a lightning storm and the terrors and the horrors of the destruction that could unleash, but it was also a way of understanding and having a system for upholding ethics. But as the scientists then come to understand that's not the reason why it rains and it thunders and it lightnings. It may seem scary on the outside to the observer, but the real reality is it's simply the phenomena of the clouds filling up with water molecules. And in the clouds, this lampoon Socrates makes the analogy that it's like when we eat some chili or whatnot at the feast, at the festival, at the rodeo, and our stomach rumbles and tumbles, and then we explode with flatulence. So the highest symbol of the old religion is lampooned by the lowest and basest bodily noise and bodily expression of gas. That, of course, wasn't what Socrates was up to. In fact, in his defense speech, in the apology, he says, I know very little about science. In an autobiographical section in Plato's Phaedo, he tells us when he was younger, he studied science, but he got so confused and bemused and perplexed by the inability of science to explain human behavior that he went on what he terms a second sailing. And he tells us about that second sailing in more detail in the apology, in his defense speech. He says that his friend Chaerephon went to the oracle at Delphi, and his friend asked the oracle, who is the wisest person in the world? And here's what the oracle responds.
The next thing that happened seems to me very serious. A friend of mine went to Delphi and had the audacity to ask the oracle whether there was any man wiser than Socrates, and the priestess answered no. This news spread among the citizenry. When I heard it, I was stunned because I never made any pretense at wisdom, and still do not now. But I resolved to do as the oracle said, and I started my question and answer games, testing each man that I met to find out whether, in fact, there was one wiser than myself. And this game has gone on from that day to this, angering many people who are stumped by my questions and leading me just about nowhere.
It's a riddle. It tells Socrates, by way of his friend Chaerephon, that Socrates was the wisest man in the world. But Socrates is most famous for saying, the one thing I know is that I know nothing. So how does he come to this conclusion, and what about that makes him wise? He tells us about his explorations to test the oracle, and in some ways even to disprove the oracle, to go about and investigate all sorts of different categories and classes of individuals that he found around the city, from the lowly craftsperson to the poets, to the religious priests, to the politicians, all different characters and figures and individuals that had a claim to wisdom, and to test their knowledge claims and to see if they really possess the knowledge that people believe them to have. And he tells us about his encounter with one famous politician in the city to test his knowledge.
Now in time, I began to meet some of these important men. I was only an ignoramus, but I very soon discovered that I knew as much about many things as these important men did. And so I asked them questions and dug needles into them and made them very angry. I didn't know the answers to these questions any more than the important men did. But I was only asking the questions, you see, so I acquired a reputation for wisdom which I didn't deserve, and which I don't deserve now.
So the riddle is that the oracle proclaims Socrates the wisest person in the world. But what is the basis of his claim to wisdom? His claim to wisdom is that he's the one person that admits he knows nothing, whereas all sorts of other people, especially the politicians, pontificate on every sort of issue as if they are authorities. I mean, think about what we expect from our politicians, that they should be experts in economics, on foreign policy, on environmental issues. How in any way could they be experts on such a wide variety of fields of knowledge? But rather than proclaiming that they don't know, they, of course, boast about how they do know. And when one proclaims that one knows, it stops one from real learning. What's the genius of proclaiming that you don't know? That Socrates says that he's an ignoramus. Well, that sounds like he's a fool. But really, it's that proclamation, that profession to say, I don't know, that's the real beginning of wisdom. That's what inspires one to start inquiring and to separate off. Yes, I've heard many things about each of these issues, about environmental issues, about foreign policy, about economic issues. I've heard all of these things. We have a lot of hearsay. We have a lot of opinions, and we have them from the left and from the right and from the center and from all sorts of different news sources. But where does the real truth lie? Well, first I have to begin by saying I don't know, and that will start the process of investigating to achieve, if possible, a grounded, reasoned account that we can justify as a true claim to knowledge. Socrates' major charge against him during his trial is that he's an atheist, and yet we see here in his divine service to the oracle, he devotes his life to questioning other people as a way of serving this oracle that said he was the wisest, to see if he could find someone wiser. And in doing so, he also is on his own intellectual journey. That is, while he claims is this religious charge, it is certainly unorthodox. And in fact, this unorthodoxy gets fine-tuned during the trial itself, where he has a cross-examination back and forth with one of his major accusers, Meletus. Meletus changes the charge that Socrates is a heterodox believer or an unorthodox believer, that he doesn't believe in the traditional gods of the city, Zeus and Athena and so forth, to the larger charge that Socrates is an out-and-out atheist, that the gods he is claiming to introduce are really no gods at all. But Socrates introduces and responds to that argument in a very important argument in the history of ideas, in the history of theology, in the history of philosophy. He introduces and argues that he could not believe in the daimonic spirit that speaks to him. He could not believe in the spiritual voices that he hears and that he can testify to without in some way believing in the gods that's sending this messenger to him.
This is the word playing of a sophist.
As to the other part of your indictment, you say that I refuse to recognize the gods of the state. Does this mean that I do not believe in gods at all? That I'm an atheist?
I assure you, jurors, he believes in no gods whatsoever.
Yet your charge also claims that I'm guilty of introducing new divinities of my own. You claim that I'm guilty both of believing in gods and not believing in gods. Can a man believe in human affairs and not humans, or horsemanship and not horses, or flute playing and not flute players? Surely you jest. I've said enough in answering Meletus's charges.
Socrates there gives us an analogy, and a very complicated one at that, to explain and justify that he is a religious believer. Let's see if we can unpack it. He says, can one believe in musical things, but not music or musician that's behind the music. If we unpack that, if we're walking through the park and we hear the flute music, but we can't see the musician, we hear the music and we testify, and we can testify that we hear the music 100%, that music exists, and we can hear, we can name the song that's being played, but yet we cannot see the musician. Do we know that there's a musician? Absolutely. Even though we can't directly see the musician, even though it may be obscured from our direct view, we can intuit that the music can only be heard if there's a musician playing the music. And likewise, Socrates is saying that I hear this spirit voice can only be if there is a God sending that spirit voice to me. This argument becomes very important in medieval theology. It's known as the argument from Quia. We see a world, and that world is indisputable. Or we see, in a similar way, the objects in the room around us, and yet we may not know who the craftsman was, whether they were male or female, whether it was a factory, whether it was made by a robot, but we can testify that the table didn't drop out of thin air with its order and its structure. There must have been an intelligent designer that put the boards together in such a way. And this argument is then used as a proof for God's existence. Sometimes people think that you can't prove that God's existence, but medieval theologians, several thousand years after Socrates, use an argument like he's employing in the Apology to argue, even though we can't directly see God, the fact that we see the effects, the object of the craftsman, the assumption could be made that there's a craftsman behind it, because how else did it get here? That's at least the argument from Quia, that we can find its origin in Socrates' argument in the Apology. He says that this provoked him. Again, this spirit voice. Now, his spirit voice that he speaks of, his daimonic voice, sometimes this is referred to as some sort of Socrates is possessed by this voice. But what does he tell us the voice speaks to him? He says that when he's about to do certain things, he stops and listens. And the only thing the voice will ever tell him is no, don't do it. Which is, I think, how we all feel when we're about to eat another donut from the box. We stop and we listen to the voice, and the voice, don't do it. Right? Something inside of us knows as a natural impulse a sense of right for wrong. Now, that's this instinctual voice. But Socrates devoted his life's work to unpacking and drawing on what we might see as an impulse by way of developing our belief system, so that our beliefs are not simply ones of opinion and not simply taken for granted ideas that we've heard from the media or from the politicians or from our contemporaries, but rather that we investigate our ideas so that each of our beliefs are grounded in knowledge and truth. And he says that he tried with all of his efforts, not only to do this in his own life, in his own soul, but he tried to provoke his fellow Athenians. In another metaphor, he compares himself as a gadfly, as the fly on the Athenians behind the slow horse that he compares Athens to provoke the horse, the one little pesky fly that could move the stubborn horse to action.
Yet I know too well the enmities I have incurred, and these will be my destruction. Not Miletus or Anytus, but men of Athens, know this: no greater good has happened to the state than my service to the god. For I do nothing but to go about persuading each of you, old and young alike, not to take thought about your person or property, but first to take care about the improvement of your soul. Think of the state as of a great horse, slow to move because of its size, I am the gadfly sent by the gods to sting the horse into action. All day long, in all places, I am fastening upon you, arousing, persuading, and reproaching you. And for this service, I have never sought payment from any of you. I have sufficient witness to the truth of that. My poverty.
Those are certainly troubling words for Socrates to attempt to win over his jury, to refer to them as the stubborn, slow horse that won't think over their lives and pursue the truth. But nonetheless, he's steadfast because the truth is the truth. And yet, the Athenians may have condemned him in his own day. The 501 jurors of many who were persuaded, the vote came down, Socrates says, a lot closer than he thought. The vote came down of 280 to convict and 221 to vindicate. And so Socrates is condemned. They ask him in a penalty phase to name what his penalty should be. And he, ironically, with his last moment of satire, perhaps says, my penalty, you should celebrate me in the public square and put me up as an Olympic victor and celebrate me in the way that anyone who has served the city should be honored and celebrated. And of course, this was the final insult brought before the Athenian court. And instead, they sentenced him to death with the cup of hemlock. While Socrates was sitting in his prison cell, his friends tried to give him an escape route. And yet Socrates calmly accepted his fate, that if this was the punishment the Athenians felt just, he would follow their law and live by their law. He lived by their law, he would die by their law. And yet Socrates was put to death, but Socrates also embodies the birth of Western philosophy, the birth of the study of ethics, and the charge remains not just to his contemporaries, but the charge remains for the next 2,500 years for all of us to lead the examined life. So we'll see everybody back soon with another spotlight lecture in the history of ideas.
Imagine I am about to flee, and the laws come to me and say, tell us, Socrates, what you are doing. Do you imagine a state can exist in which the decisions of law have no power, but are set aside and trampled by individuals? Perhaps I would answer, yes, but the state has injured me and given an unjust sentence. And the laws would answer, but what was our agreement with you? Were you not born and raised and educated under the laws of the state? Did you not agree to obey us? Not in haste, but after 70 years of consideration, during which you were free to leave the city at any time if you thought us unfair. Because we think it right to destroy you, do you think you have the right to destroy us?